Welcome back to the channel. Legacy in the comic book industry is a really fickle thing. A lot of times, something that you do somewhat early in your career will literally define how people think about you the rest of your career, no matter what you do. Alan Moore is defined by The Watchmen. Frank Miller is defined by The Dark Knight Returns. Chuck Austen is defined by his X-Men run. And Tom King really is defined by Heroes in Crisis. To a lesser degree, Batman issue number 50 and Killing Sales on Batman. But in my opinion, when people think about Tom King these days and why they don't like him as a comic book writer, they almost always turn to Heroes in Crisis. Recently, he talked to CBR.com about a lot of the work that he's done at DC Comics, and Heroes in Crisis came up during the interview, and he actually shows a bit of personal growth, admitting Heroes in Crisis was a mistake and understanding, at least to a degree, why people hate Heroes in Crisis so much. I say it's the worst story in modern comic book history. And there's nobody in this world that can change my mind on that one. I absolutely hate that series. And I know I'm not alone, you're not alone. And while he definitely does understand a couple of the reasons why people don't like Heroes in Crisis, I think for the most part, he doesn't get why Heroes in Crisis was not just a bad fit for Wally West. It was a bad fit for DC Comics, period. He wants to think of himself as the modern day Alan Moore, but Alan Moore, when he had a story that didn't fit DC Comics or even the Charlton characters, was able to go out there, make his own characters, his own universe, where the story actually fits and makes sense. Shockingly, The Watchmen is still considered one of the greatest comic book stories of all times, and in my opinion, probably influential for all the wrong reasons. I've got 3 clips of the interview with Tom King talking about what went wrong with Heroes in Crisis. We're going to listen to all 3. I've got opinions on them. Let's hear about the first reason why Tom King thinks Heroes in Crisis didn't work.
Oh man, people hate that poor little book, and I love it so much.
Yeah, can you tell us, what do you think makes that book so divisive?
I think the casting on it makes it divisive. Well, there's 2 things. Number one, it has a terrible title. I should have come up with a better title. I called it Heroes in Crisis. That's every time I see the title, I was like, oh, I should have called it Sanctuary. That's a much better title than Heroes in Crisis. I was just going for the Crisis title, probably just to make money. That's a good lesson to all young creators. Like, go for the art, not the money.
He's absolutely right. Heroes in Crisis was a terrible title for this series. Sanctuary definitely would have fit the series a lot more, but I don't think that's really the big problem with Sanctuary within the DC Comics universe. When he lays out the structure and the rules around Sanctuary and why it exists within the DC Comics universe, none of it really makes sense. If you go back and read that thing, it doesn't age very well. I think that he should have had confidence in himself and his story, moved it outside of the DC Comics universe, went out and created his own characters, and had confidence in himself and the story that he had to tell, that it was going to be impactful. And I think it would have worked much better there. A Black Label series, but not in the DC Comics universe and not featuring DC heroes. I think if he would have bet on himself and his creative team to get this story over, I think this would have been much more successful. He does go on to talk about one of the bigger issues, and I think he gets this one totally wrong as well.
And number 2, Wally West had been set up from Rebirth as sort of the new hope of the universe. And I came up with the main characters, and he was sort of, and then the, DC told me, okay, this is the cast. I was like, these are the 2, I need 2 suspects and an actual murderer. And they said, okay, it's going to be Booster, Harley, and Wally. And I was like, that's great. That was my big mistake. I should not have said that was great. Because making Wally, who was that big hope, even though he has, to me, there was such sadness in his rebirth because he got reborn without his family. And to me, that is a horrible thing. I have children, I have a wife, I live for them. And like, oh great, I'm back, my family's back, wonderful. Or my uncles, like my superhero family's back, but my real family is gone? Like, to me, that would tear my soul apart. And that's what it's about. It's about him sort of experiencing that.
First off, this is an issue that we see across the board within comic books. Comic book writers coming in with a story to tell, but it doesn't necessarily have to be about the hero in their history, in their journey. It ends up being a very personal story about the writer's journey. And they end up taking these characters and they break them apart over the story that they actually want to tell. They need to stop doing this. If you want to tell those stories, you need to go to the indies or create your own characters and universe on DC Black Label like Philip Kennedy Johnson did with The Last God, and stop breaking other people's things, characters and heroes and universes that people are invested in, to tell the story that's important to you, but not really important to the hero. That never works. Second of all, what hero in the DC Comics universe would Heroes in Crisis have worked for? Would it have worked for Superman to have post-traumatic stress disorder, be checked into Sanctuary to deal with his emotional issues, be so depressed that when he finally realized other people were experiencing this, he had a dramatic outburst of energy, murdering every other hero in Sanctuary, realizing at that point he's a mass murderer, go time travel, kill himself, bring the body back, and then frame 2 innocent people for the murders. I don't think that story works for Superman. I don't think that story works for Batman, Green Lantern, Flash. Certainly it didn't work for that character. Wonder Woman. I don't think that story works for any of the heroes in the DC Comics universe. Maybe a Constantine, but even then, with that character, I don't believe that this story particularly would have worked because it doesn't fit the DC Comics universe. It's not a heroic story. It's something much more akin to The Watchmen. It's a cynical take on superheroes. The problem being, for the most part, when you look at the history of DC Comics, it's not a cynical superhero universe. It's all about hope. It's all about superheroes doing the right thing when they need to, stepping up to the plate and saving the universe time and time again. This story probably would fit better in the Marvel Comics universe, but even then, I don't think there's very many heroes in the Marvel Comics universe that this story in particular, it just doesn't fit the nature of superheroes from the big 2. That's why it should have never been published there. DC Comics editorial should have known this from the get-go and said, hey, we like your story, but we don't think it's right for our characters and our universe. Let's try doing it somewhere else. Which would have been very easy, as King himself said. He had written the story, he just needed the DC characters to fit into the story, and that's why it didn't work. This is the final quote from Tom King in his interview, and then I'll have my final thoughts.
But the audience, I think a large chunk of the audience, because he was the symbol of rebirth, was like, I know he has that, but we still love him as this person. It's like, it's like movie casting. You don't want to see The Rock looking out the window and crying. You want to see him punching somebody. I just think he was cast poorly. If I had to do it again, I would cast a different thing. But besides, I think it's a wonderful thing. It speaks to issues that are really important to me, and it's drawn by Clay Mann, and it's the most beautiful art you've ever seen.
A lot of people like to go out of their way and discredit Tom King as a writer as if he's not talented. And in that regard, I cannot agree with them at all. I think he's a very frustrating writer. When he's on, he's actually one of the most capable writers in the comic book industry. The problem is, most of his stories end up opening up great. The hook is good. The mystery is really there. You get invested in the characters, but in the end, it's going to be miserable torture porn that destroys established heroes. Heroes in Crisis, his Batman run, Strange Adventures, Human Target, Batman Catwoman. It's all the same. A waste of a good writer who will be defined by 2 things for the rest of his career: destroying sales on Batman with issue 50, The Wedding That Never Happened, and Heroes in Crisis, the systematic destruction of the symbol of hope in DC Rebirth, Wally West. Whenever I talk about Tom King here on the channel, and I am very critical of a lot of his stories because it is mostly the same thing. It's character deconstruction. You can only go back to the same writing trope so many times. It's character deconstruction with poetry, or it's character deconstruction with music lyrics, something like that. It gets very repetitive, but there is a large section of people that actually like Tom King's work, because for a lot of people, even being depressed or being nauseated at the story that you're reading is better than being numb to everything. We're never allowed to communicate freely really anymore. Even here on YouTube, I can mostly say a lot of my thoughts and feelings about comic books and stories and whatnot, but I absolutely have to censor myself, because if I actually express myself and use some of the terms that I would like to, I know I would get in trouble. It's the same thing when you go out into the real world. You can't communicate freely with anybody. And if you want to feel like you belong to something, maybe you want to be affiliated with a group or something, political, maybe a club or whatever, you end up having to express feelings and agree with things in your heart of hearts you don't agree with, but to be a part of the hive, you have to express support for things. Nobody's really allowed to communicate openly anymore. We're more connected now than we ever have been, but it feels like we're more disconnected now than ever because no one's allowed to freely express themselves. You're always on pins and needles around everyone. If you upset somebody, whether you meant to or not, people are going to call you names. They're going to go to your employer. They're going to try and get you fired. They're going to put you on blast on social media, and people are just going to come down like an avalanche on you just for having an opinion or maybe having a bad day and doing something that you truly do regret. It's really strange. Reading Tom King comics is like being a cutter in a couple of ways. His fans do it to remove the numbness many are going through in their day-to-day lives. Tom King writes these stories to expose his emotional pain and trauma for the world to see. In the end, neither is particularly healthy in my opinion. Going dark works every once in a while. Going dark every single month and sometimes twice a month for years on end is bad. While I'm glad Tom King finally accepts some responsibility for Heroes in Crisis and why people hate it so much, in the end, I don't think he really understands why people hated it. It was never going to work for any hero in the DC Comics universe. It's not a superhero story. It's a PTSD story. It didn't belong in the DC Comics universe with DC heroes. It needed to be its own thing, kind of like The Watchmen. But he didn't have the confidence in his own story, in his own abilities, so he had to back it up with 80 years of history behind it with DC Comics superheroes, and this story will define him for the rest of his career. This and what he did on Batman. And he's done so many bad things with other characters as well. If you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, or maybe you don't remember exactly everything that he did with Heroes in Crisis, it is the most hated comic book in modern history for a reason. Recently, I talked about it, went back, talked about all the things that didn't work in Heroes in Crisis and why it's hated by so many DC Comics readers. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out here, or there's a link in the video description.